Okay, so cranial nerves are the next part of the lecture. Cranial nerves extend from the brain to the head and neck, carrying sensory information and motor commands. Cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, like the spinal nerves. Okay, they are almost all of them outside of the brain. Therefore, they are peripheral nervous system parts and not central nervous system parts. There are 12 cranial nerves, and they exit the ventral or inferior side of the brain. They exit near their associated sensory or motor nuclei, and the nuclei are in the cerebrum, diencephalon, and brainstem. The cranial nerves exit the cranium through holes in the base of the cranium. And here's a picture where they've removed the brain, they left the cranial nerves. And from here, these cranial nerves are going to exit holes in the cranium. This slide gives you the names of the cranial nerves and also the locations of the cranial nerve nuclei. And you can, read the list. Should we read it together?
1, the olfactory nerve. 2, the optic nerve. 3, the oculomotor nerve. 4, the trochlear nerve. 5, the trigeminal nerve. 6, the abducens nerve. 7, the facial nerve. 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. 10, the vagus. 11, the accessory nerve. And 12, the hypoglossal nerve.
And then over here in this diagram, we learn that the location of the cranial nerve nuclei for cranial nerve 1 is in the cerebrum. For cranial nerve 2 is in the thalamus. Then for cranial nerve 3 and 4, the nuclei are in the midbrain. For cranial nerves 5 through 8, the nuclei are in the pons. For cranial nerves 8 through 12, the nuclei are in the medulla. Now, you may have noticed that 8 shows up in the pons and the medulla. That's because 8 is at the border between the two, and they therefore include the cranial nerve 8 in each area. And there's a picture, and there's a little, if you want to, you can try to find the cranial nerves in the picture there. Some of them are difficult to find, but it's helpful to go back and forth between the cartoon and the real specimen. Okay, cranial nerves are classified based on their primary function, which might be special sensory, plain sensory, motor, or mixed sensory and motor. Cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 also carry parasympathetic nervous system motor axons, along with their usual cranial nerve axons. Then I have a little star on motor because some cranial nerves that are classified as motor actually do have some sensory axons for proprioception. So cranial nerves. The cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is a special sensory nerve that carries smell into the brain. The olfactory nerve actually has its cell bodies of the nerve in the olfactory bulb, which is right above the olfactory nerves that actually hang down into the nasal cavity. And they extend from the olfactory bulb through the holes in the cribriform plate that we learned about. So axons from the olfactory nerves in the nasal cavity, synapse and cells in the olfactory bulbs, and then axons of the cells in the bulbs travel in the olfactory tracts. The bulbs and the tracts are part of the cerebrum. The tracts travel to the olfactory cortex all the way in the temporal lobe. The olfactory nerve is the only cranial nerve that synapses directly on the cerebrum. All the other cranial nerves terminate or originate within nuclei of the diencephalon, that is cranial nerve 4, or the brainstem, that is all the other cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. Special sensory vision. Vision will be discussed in a later lecture, so I'll say no more at this time. We'll come back to it. Cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, is a motor nerve to the superior, medial, and inferior rectus and the inferior oblique muscles. Also on the oculomotor nerve are fibers from the parasympathetic nervous system motor that go to the sphincter pupillae muscle for pupil constriction and ciliary muscle for relaxing the lens in the eye. And again, we will learn about this in the vision lecture. So this is our first nerve that carries parasympathetic nervous system motor fibers, and we're going to start learning a mnemonic called Only Forgot Visceral. And the first letter of each of these words stands for one of the cranial nerves. So here's our O from the oculomotor nerve. Moving on with the cranial nerves, cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. It is motor to the superior oblique muscle. And remember that the superior oblique muscle passes through the trochlea or pulley on the medial bony orbit, and that's where the trochlear nerve got its name. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, has 3 divisions. It's the largest cranial nerve. The V1 ophthalmic division is sensory to the upper face, or sensory from the upper face. V2, the maxillary division, is sensory from the middle face. V3, the mandibular division, is sensory from the lower face. And then V3, the mandibular division, also carries motor fibers to the muscles of mastication. And here's just pictures of the sensory areas that are innervated by the different branches of the trigeminal nerve. So there's V1 by the forehead, V2 by the nose, and V3 by the chin. And then this slide talks separately about how the V3 division, the mandibular division, is sensory to the lower face, but also motor to muscles of mastication. And here to remind you is the masseter muscle, the temporalis muscle, and behind the bone, which has been cut here, the lateral pterygoid, and finally the medial pterygoid. Cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, is motor to the lateral rectus muscle. It abducts the eye, which is where it got the name abducens. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 together innervate the 6 extraocular muscles.
So cranial nerve 3 goes to the superior, medial, and inferior rectus and the inferior oblique. Cranial nerve 4 goes to the superior oblique, and cranial nerve 6 goes to the lateral rectus.
Okay, cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. It's a mixed nerve, and I have to say, a lot of these following cranial nerves do a lot, so they're mixed, right? So why is it mixed? It carries special sensory, which is taste, from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And then it is motor to facial expression muscles. And it carries some parasympathetic nervous system fibers that are motor to tear, mucus, and saliva glands. And let's go back up here and get our mnemonic and pull it down. Our mnemonic was only foregut visceral. And now we're talking about the facial nerve. So that's the F with more to come. Here's a clinical correlation. Bell's palsy is an inflammation of the facial nerve that causes paralysis of the facial muscles on one side of the face. It's thought to be caused by a viral infection. It is pretty common. It usually resolves on its own in weeks to months. And of course, people do not like it because people do not like being paralyzed on one half of their face. Luckily, though, it usually resolves or gets much better over time. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. It is special sensory. The vestibulo part carries sensory about balance, and the cochlear part carries sensory about hearing. So in the picture here, you see that there is the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve, and they come together and form the vestibulocochlear nerve. That is cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, is a mixed nerve. I think that this is the most complex of the cranial nerves. It is actually overall mostly sensory. It is special sensory, taste on the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, then sensory to, touch and feeling, like of pain and temperature, that kind of thing, from the palate and the pharynx mucosa. And then it has a, these 2 unique sensory modalities. It innervates the carotid body, which monitors gases in blood. The gases being oxygen and carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide causes the pH of blood to decrease, become more acidic. So it's monitoring the gas in blood and the pH of blood, because it innervates the carotid body. It also innervates the carotid sinus, which monitors blood pressure. So there's that. And if you look at the picture, you'll see that there is the common carotid artery, which I showed a picture of before when I was showing you the blood supply to the brain. And now here there are these two little swellings, one of which is the carotid body, and the other of which is the carotid sinus. So they're like areas in the wall of the common carotid vessel. Lastly, cranial nerve 9, still working on it. The glossopharyngeal nerve is motor to the pharynx muscles that are involved in swallowing and speaking, and motor to the parotid and salivary gland through fibers of the parasympathetic nervous motor system. So now we have our G from our mnemonic, only 4 got visceral, G, glossopharyngeal. 10, this is a huge nerve. Cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. It's a mixed nerve. It is special sensory to taste in the pharynx, sensory to the ear and the diaphragm, motor to the palate and pharynx muscles. It carries parasympathetic nervous system sensory and motor axons that go to many visceral organs. The word vagus means wanderer, and it was called that because it seemed to wander just about everywhere. And when we do the autonomic nervous system and we learn about the vagus nerve, you will see that it does a tremendous amount of work throughout the body, innervating many visceral organs. All from the vagus nerve, which starts way up in the medulla, and then the axons of which travel down, 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 all the way to the colon. Cranial nerve 11, the accessory nerve, is motor to the palate, pharynx, and larynx muscles for speaking and swallowing, and also motor to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. The accessory nerve originates from 2 roots, the cranial root in the medulla and the spinal root in the cervical spinal cord. So this is the cranial nerve that is at the very bottom of the medulla and even has a little bit of the nucleus in the cervical spinal cord. Okay, now cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve, is motor to tongue muscles. It is below them, therefore is called hypo for below and glossal for tongue. It's located superior and medial to the accessory nerve. So if we look at this little tiny picture that I haven't called your attention to before, but it's a picture of the ventral side or inferior side of the brain, you will see I have boxed off a little tiny area showing the cranial nerve 12 and how it is actually superior to cranial nerve 11. This is unusual. All of the other cranial nerves march down from superior to inferior, so that's why I'm mentioning it. All right, so that's that. I will see you soon.